Okay, Charles, if you want to go into basically the history and how you got
Okay.
involved.
All right. In the winter of 1964, a young couple came to Taliesin West looking for some architecture because they were going to start a school. They had an idea for a new private school in Racine, Wisconsin. And the young couple were Sam and Jean Johnson of the Johnson family. Sam at that time was just starting in the business. His father was the chairman of the board. They spoke to Wes Peters about it, and Wes knew that I had done some work in schools and also that I had been a school teacher. So he called me in. I happened to have some sketches, and this got them excited. And they decided to go ahead with us to build a new school. Wes had an idea about how to do it, and he told that to me. And so I started making some sketches. And it so happened that Wes was involved with a princess in Iran at the time, and I had to go there. And it came about that Johnsons were anxious to go ahead. They suddenly had to rev up their schedule because they were going to open the following year. And Wes, though, asked them to wait till he got back, but they weren't too anxious. And Mrs. Wright said, well, you know, why should they wait? And pushed me into the breach. So I started making designs. We met that winter in Wing Spread. A nice setting for a situation like that. We had conferences with fires in the fireplaces, and so forth. And over the course of the first year, we met there during all seasons. That in itself, of course, was an inspiration. Then we got some plans, some broad plans, long-range plans for the whole campus. And they originally had intended to start in an old house. And that was one of the reasons for the original rush. But then they found out to convert the house to meet the code, it would require too much. It would have been virtually impossible. So they decided to go ahead and try to do a set of plans to start in the spring of 1965 construction. So in that being the case, we had to design something special, and we threw away all the long-range plans that we had. But it was exciting, and we had to look around to see what strikes were coming up, what materials were going to be available, what would be the simplest shape. At the same time, they'd hired a new headmaster who was all enamored about a new idea of a prefab schools that somebody was pushing, educational area. I guess it was like a think tank. We're pushing it, and it was a good idea, but there was no way we could use it. This idea was not ready to go, so we went ahead with our scheme. And in the 25th of May, we went out and drove a stake in the ground, which is to be the center of the school, because the school we designed was literally a circle. And it was a circle that could be completed in stages. And the first stage was about 3/4 of a circle and had to contain a little kitchen, restaurant. And it had to have a certain amount of flexibility to it because nobody knew what was going to happen, education in the future. So we used a series of demountable walls, and which would fit in the pie-shaped segments of the first circle. And we found a local contractor that was willing to undertake the job, start, and promise that he'd get it done, which the schedule called for 87 days. So we had to get the plans. We got an associated firm in Madison to help produce the plans, and we got the building underway. The plans approved by the state, that also had to be done. I think that Johnson's flew the plans over, and one of their people in their private plane over to Madison to get the approvals to go on. It was a very flat site and with no obstructions on it, so that made things simpler. But to continue with it, the building did progress on schedule rapidly, and toward the end, I remember being there on the site at one time, and the plumbers were down on the floor in what was to be the floor, arranging the piping. At the same time, the contractor was coming in with one of these little machines that dumped the gravel, spreading the gravel right behind the plumbers, so it was pretty necessary that they get their work done and get out of the way. But the building was completed and then opened for the first year of school. That was kind of a triumph. And then, of course, the following winter, why Mrs. Johnson got the idea that they needed a gymnasium, and they needed a lot of things, but they decided they would do that, so we changed the master plan somewhat. We kind of developed a new master plan as we went along. And so we planned this gymnasium and a partial completion of the circle. And this building had to be built partly underground, and because it was such a high building, and it contained lockers and so forth. And then every summer there for the next few years, we built an addition. I think about 8 or 9 additions went like that. Then we slowed the pace a little bit and went every other year. And finally, I think the last edition was the 17th, and we worked there from over 35 years off and on. So we got to know the Johnsons well. Sam's father, Hib Johnson, gave one of the first big donations to the school. He was very much interested in sports, and we built a field house, a great big facility where they could play basketball or tennis or any kind of indoor sports. That was a nice challenge. And Hib then retired and passed the baton on to Sam, then, who became chairman of the board, and then his wife, Jean, whose idea I think was really the primary instigator of the school, became the chairman of the school, and which position which he still holds. And they were always enthusiastic about building, and they were pretty patient, and they'd had a lot of experience working in the administration building, and so they knew they were very knowledgeable about architecture, and that made it wonderful to work with. But they gave us restraints because Sam was interested in making this prosperous type of school. He was a businessman, and he felt that school should be operated that way. I think probably eventually he discovered that they require endowments, and he had idea of bringing in the children of the families of the Johnson empire, you might say, or the worldwide business. And that was sort of a custom anyway, that executives from Japan and Russia, South America, wherever they came from, would come and bring their families and stay for a year or two. So that changed the character of the school to some extent, because the student population was international in scope, international, interracial, and they were pretty forward-looking in that regard. In fact, the whole company had a history of it, but particularly the school. I remember we started with a small faculty, and the first summer we had the faculty, when the school was open, we had invited the faculty, which I think consisted of about 15 people at the time, over here, and had a movie and had a dinner and so forth, the way we usually do. It made a nice kind of interaction, and we've known some of the faculty. The Johnsons, of course, because of the company practice, provided very good terms for the school, for the faculty, better than they would get in an ordinary, certainly a public school, and much better, I think, than even private schools. Consequently, the faculty stayed, and I worked with them very carefully. The first buildings, of course, were done primarily with Gene Johnson and the headmaster. And I remember one wintertime they came down to Arizona. It happened to be a very cold and windy night, and they wanted to work. Had been working all day on the plans, and they still wanted to keep going. And the wind was blowing, and at that time the canvas, the drafting room down there, had been replaced. but it was replaced with a kind of new, sort of stiffer kind of nylon material, which flapped and made a lot of noise. But we all sort of joked about it. But we worked then on one of the building designs that way. And then, of course, as they grew, they recognized they had to have an upper school, a lower school, and so we started naturally with one school, which then became the middle school, and then we built a lower school, and we built a dining room, cafeteria, an art gallery. That was exciting. And then one winter, this new building with the art gallery and the lower school caught fire and burned. And it was apparently somebody in the art department had left a coffee pot full of oil, as near as we could tell, and left it on, which is something that can happen, and it burned at night. So we were called up in the middle. This was another rush job to rebuild it. We had the plans, of course, and we made certain changes and rebuilt it and built an addition to it. So we had that long history, and at that time I'd be flying back and forth from Arizona, and I based sometimes in Racine, sometimes in Milwaukee, and more often in Chicago. And I worked with the contractors. That was one of the things that we did during the first rapid construction period. Actually, I spent time in a hotel room interviewing the subcontractors, checking shop drawings, doing all the things that an architect usually does out of his office, but we set up there. Then, as we grew, and as the faculty developed, then they became more involved, and Mrs. Johnson was a great proponent of having a faculty building committee, so they set that up, and the people who were especially interested in a particular building that was being built, they were brought into the planning process, and I thought that was very successful, better than having the headmaster make the decisions. And so the first major building that we did that way was the theater. And there we had to develop typical of today, what happens, we had to develop a multi-purpose theater because they had music, they had drama, they had television, they had, see, what else goes with that? But anyway, they had, and then they used it for study hall and used it for graduations, of course, and orchestra, and that is music and drama. Sort of, there is a conflict there because of the acoustics. So we called in an acoustical consultant and worked together, and we developed this small hall, 300 seats for a small school, and we developed a system of curtains which adjusted the acoustics in the building for music and for drama, and apparently it was very successful. They had a stage that would drop to make an orchestra pit. We had a lot of sophisticated machinery and technology like that. That was a very interesting experience, and fortunately, we had a lot of theater experience in the office at the time because we had built, I think, 26 theaters around the country, in Florida and California and Arizona, and different sizes. But this theater was the smallest of this kind that we'd ever done. And it was interesting because we had a chance then, by that time, to break out of the mold of typical schools where the budgets drove so many things. We still operated with budgets, but they were a little willing to put better finishes, and we got some skylights, which was kind of a bone of contention with the Johnsons. They'd lived with them and with the administration building, and there had been problems of leaks, and they had to get solved. But we proved that you could have them, and you wouldn't have trouble because companies had manufactured skylights by that time. And that made a nice feature because as you go down the main corridor of the upper school, its corridor is nicely lit, and the classrooms are off at one size. We designed specialized classrooms, and one of the first things, the first school that made it so buildable in a hurry was that part of the walls were cabinets that were used for storage and bookshelves, and they were manufactured off the site in a mill, and then they were brought in, and the wall panels were also brought in. So while the building was being constructed, these other things could be worked on and made and then brought in at the last minute. But the theater experience, working with the drama coach and the musical director and the television people, all working together, they all recognized that they had to have, there had to be some give. They couldn't, everybody couldn't have the thing. So when we presented it to the board, I made a little cartoon and I had a slideshow to sell them the idea. And this cartoon showed the theater, big circle, from the musician standpoint. And I had another one that showed this, and then it showed drama as a small circle. Then I did another one where it kind of reversed, where the communications was the big thing. And then another one where, of course, the theater was the big thing. And then I had one from the finance directors where the budget was tiny and then big, and that made a hit. So every now and then we'd do something like that. I don't remember the last school we did when the new upper school. We presented, we had a series of meetings. We did the same way with that, and we did the same thing with the new library, or resource center as they call it. We had a faculty committee with the people that are especially interested in that. And when we did the building in the upper school, we also had the upper school faculty and worked with that committee. Some were interested and some were less so, but it sort of, those who were interested then came regularly to the meetings, and then we developed the program and got them. Actually, the building rose out of their concerns and their needs. And the headmaster, the new headmaster at that time, Mark Murphy, who was an interesting character in himself because he used to be a professional hockey player and had to have his face rebuilt. But he was a very charming Irishman. And he had this idea of a great space in the building, and that was to be the commons for the school, where the high school could all congregate, sort of an informal place where they could have people coming and going, and they could study, they could serve. They had a bagel hour, I think, in the morning, break, coffee and bagel. And the classrooms then were around that great open space, and the space was lit naturally by a big clerestory, by one tall daylight, natural light like this here. And I guess I should start over again.
So you're talking about the dome,
with
the lighting,
yeah,
celestial type lighting.
right. We'd tried that. We'd proposed that several times during the early days of the school. The dining room, we wanted to have the dining room roof, which was a cone. We wanted to have it raised up with a band of glass around. But those days that was too expensive, so we didn't. They've always regretted that. The original library also was done that way to bring in natural light. Well, now, of course, they understand it all, and they're so tickled when we did do the two buildings with the clerestory and the natural light. They understand it very well. Also, it was one of the early applications of energy efficient lighting, because we used a series of lights that shone up on that ceiling and then bounced back down off of the ceiling. We didn't do a lot of calculations, but it just like the way Mr. Wright used to work. It was, it seemed like the natural thing to do, and it was wonderful. But the colors and lighting under natural lighting is different and better than all this artificial lighting. Well, we had both, and it was, and I actually throughout the school, the original school, when we were building so fast too, we developed a kind of lighting that hung down from the ceiling and reflected back up on the ceiling, and it too was made up of standard units so that they could be prefabricated. and assembled quickly on the side. And the heating and the cooling in that first building was probably was really inexpedient, but in order to get it done in a hurry, we used little individual package units. And it works successfully, but it was costly to operate. But it allowed us to get up and running and get started. The upper school and the, let's see, maybe I've covered everything.
What about things like any special considerations that computers are really popular in schools? Can you talk?
Yes, well, the Student Resource Center, which was brought about by an outgrowing the original library, so a new building facility, but by that time computers were so much in evidence, and Dell and Apple were donating a lot of equipment to schools, or making even a school like this. So we had the two different, the PCs and the Macintoshes, and they had classrooms for that, and we had special counters that were designed. We had a special room. We tried out all these things. We went down to Chicago and studied a typical setup that Apple had there, where we took care of the cables. That's the important thing. You have all this stuff running around, and you know how that is. So that was interesting too, and that moved so fast. So that those two editions that involved that, the newer editions, and we put ducts in the floor for future use, and I don't think any of them have been used. We debated back and forth because we sort of anticipated the day when all the computers would be operating probably like cellular phones, but we weren't sure of the technology, so we had to have the cables. And we were always trying to be ahead in the science department too. When we did the new science laboratories, the Johnsons flew I had two young women architects working with me, and they flew them down to one to Cornell and one to a place in Virginia where it's supposed to be the cutting edge of science labs and so forth. They were very cooperative that way. That was one of the nice things, having the Johnson Company at our disposal and their private plane. But Mrs. Johnson was very much interested in pushing things like that, so we were fortunate that way.
Okay, so what year was that, by the way?
The last one was begun in '64. The SRC was begun in '89. And 90 and 91, I think, was the time when we designed and constructed it. Those didn't go so fast, thank goodness, although the upper school went relatively fast. It was started in January of '94 and completed by Thanksgiving. And we had, over the time, we used different contractors and different ways of building the building. The Johnson Company loaned us one of their top men, Scott Weiss, who oversaw normally a lot of their construction, which goes on all over the world. And he had the ability to push and ride herd on the contractor, so to speak, and help. It was very cooperative. We had regular meetings the way you usually do in a big job. And he was concerned with what we call the architect or the design intent. And so the things that we would run into in a normal school building, probably where the design intent was the least considered, you know, the economics would be more considered. In that case, why, that was one of the factors, as well as faculty utilization. The faculty was pretty good because they ended up, the way things were, they all had very nice little offices, but they were pretty small, and they did have views. Mrs. Johnson, that was another thing that she always wanted, the classrooms and all the interior spaces to have some view outside, some connection with the outside.
Now the design, at least of the original plan, was it's circular. What about the interior space? Can you talk about
most of the interior spaces of the classrooms were more pie shape. The circle was divided into segments, and which meant that the rooms would not be a regular rectangle. They were somewhat pie, but it wasn't too confining because the spaces were fairly big. And they did have the outside windows, and the corridors on the inside of the first school also looked into a courtyard. So, and we kind of kept that as a theme running through. That did make it a little more expensive than your average public school, which usually has corridors around a big gym or auditorium. When we had a chance for an appendage or something, we usually went to a circle or some geometric form. The original biology center was simply an appendage which terminated in a little glass pyramid, but I didn't quite sell that, so we went for a more normal greenhouse. But I thought that was such a nice idea. But IMP did pick that up, use that for the Louvre in Paris. So, but the library, for example, was a little circle. And it was logical for several reasons, because then we used the walls with these shelves that were cantilevered off of the walls. It made a lot of space for books, and it lasted us, must be 10 years at least. It was adequate. And we had designed special furniture. That was another thing that was nice too. We kept, everything was done in birch, and except the dining room, Mrs. Johnson wanted teak. She got some teak furniture. And the art department was, then we broke away from a complete circle. The art department became more of a football shaping plan, actually. And it had 3 levels. It had the entrance level, which was the same level as the school. Then you went down a small ramp to where the dirty work of the art, like the welding and the plaster and the pottery, took place. And on a mezzanine above that were desktops and drawing tables and easels, and where that took place. And the art director, who was there from the beginning and is still there, had his office, and he had a little loft in his office so that he could, from that little loft, he could look out and see Lake Michigan. That's the one thing we were never able to accomplish. We were so close to the lake, and we tried several times to do something that gave us a view of the lake. And one time I designed something that looked like a rocket on a launch pad, and that would have been a lot of fun. And occasionally, you know, we'd throw in these things, and they were a lot of fun, but we never quite sold them. So,
can you tell me how did you come about developing the idea of a circular plan for a school? What was it? The conditions? Was it what the client wanted? Was it how did it enter your mind to develop a circular?
Well, working with Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, it wasn't hard to get into circles. As he himself had made some remark about after he'd done a few circular houses, the Guggenheim and thing, he said that every architect's going to be using a compass, and you just see. So, but I worked on the David Wright house that Frank Lloyd Wright had designed for his son David. I was a block tender, mason tender, and a block cutter, and worked with a mason, and of course that gave me a lot of experience, and I see that it wasn't impossible to do. I knew all the tricks that you could explain so contractors didn't get frightened by the curves. And so, but that wasn't the idea. The idea came when I was designing the school just for the fun of it. I was thinking from the standpoint of a teacher and how a nice classroom would be. And it was actually not so much a circle as it was a 12-sided figure, and that was one of the classrooms that the Johnsons saw in our first meeting. I also designed one that was simpler, it was square, but these little classrooms were separate pods, so to speak. They were connected, but each classroom sort of had its own probably 200-degree view. Now that the forerunner of that probably came from the famous school at Crow Island, Winnetka, where it was Saarinen did a school where the corridors went down, and the classrooms were like branches or flower. They're like little plants on a vine, appendages, and that sort of struck the fancy. Of course, Crow Island, Winnetka had a lot of money too, so that was possible for them to do. But I thought that was very nice. It struck a lot of architects at the time. And that probably was the partially inspiration for my original design. But when we got to building it, of course, we couldn't do that because of the time and the cost and everything. So we simply went to this complete circle. It seemed logical.
Could you briefly describe what it's like to know that you have to have this school constructed within a limit of 87 days?
Well, it's a lot of work. You have to get together a crew, and you have to trust them. We didn't have many people. We had a draftsman and a structural engineer and mechanical people, and get them together. It would be a little intimidating now. I like to take a little more time because you don't have, if something doesn't go quite the way you want to, an appearance or anything like that, there's not much you can do about it. You have to just. And I know from the design process, myself and my colleagues, and of course being with Frank Lloyd Wright, that he was always changing. The Guggenheim Museum was changed so many times up to the very end. When they flopped the drawing over, they had to erase all the lettering and hand take. Nowadays with a computer, you just mirror image it and bang, it's done. But because the zoning would not permit the building to overhang the street the way Mr. Wright wanted it. He always is trying to encroach a little bit on behalf of the client. But so it is kind of but we were used to doing it, and we'd done it also in our own office with the Arizona Biltmore. When it burned, it's almost exactly the same amount of time. They had the Arizona Biltmore was booked for a Price Waterhouse convention, and they had to make it. So, but it was it took a lot of people. A lot of things were not done properly as nicely as I'd like to do, and you just didn't have the time to do them.
I would assume that you were not using computers in
No.
the beginning.
No, we didn't. I didn't start on a computer to 87, 89. By the time we did the new library or the resource center, that was done on a computer, and that was partially circular. It was tucked in between some of the other buildings, so it's sort of a fish-shaped form. But
are there? Can you speak to any innovations or special design features? I know you already spoke about a lot of them. Is there anything in particular that if we were to go there that
well, I think in the resource center, the brick columns, we sort of turned what Mr. Wright did for the Johnson administration building, where the supports of the roof were these columns that grew like and flowered at the top. We did it the other way around. We made a cylinder of brick through which the ducts came up for air and the pipes came up for the lighting. And in the top of the cylinder, which didn't go clear to the ceiling, it just went to, like, for instance, this level there, the lights then shone up on the upper ceiling. And there was, in the Commons, the new building, the upper school building, we used an upside down ceiling, sort of like the belly of a fish or a ship. And that reflected the light in from the clerestory windows and down, and also acoustically it helped diffuse the sound. And they were just they were experiments, and we were willing to try. That's one thing I think we learned from Frank Lloyd Wright. The way the man from Johnson Wax put it, that Frank Lloyd Wright was willing to take risks. And there's a brilliant structural engineer, and well, Roebling and a lot of engineers today, the contemporary architect, Calatrava, he's willing to take risks, and I think we got a little that. I was much more timid generally, but Mr. Wright was certainly willing to push the bounds of architecture.
Generally, were you successful in most of your
Yeah, I think it was pretty successful.
designs?
I think the worst things were where we didn't get the natural daylight in those cases. I know the client, the faculty, and Mrs. Johnson all feel that it was a mistake not to put those clear story windows, like the original little library, which now has become a conference room. But you walk in there, it's dead because fluorescent lights and artificial lighting and no natural lighting, and they all realize that now because they have it everywhere else. And we even talked about correcting it by raising or doing some work which could be done to bring in natural light.
Yeah, could you talk also? Okay, I'm sorry. If you're not
Well, I was just going to say, I think at one point you asked if something didn't turn out too successfully, and that was a case where we did have a skylight in the middle of a cone dome. We got the, but it's just a commercial skylight. It's a little bubble, and it's just not successful. It's all right. It works. They don't complain, but it bothers me because it could have been something a little more related, you know.
Also,
It looks a little obscene, actually. Looks like a nipple.
What really attracted me from the road, was the roof. Can you just briefly discuss the...
Well, the original roof was flat, of course, and sprawled out over as the building developed, and it was sort of like almost like a natural form of some kind of grew, the building. But as we got into bigger buildings, and we did get into more dramatic shape, the field house had a big half dome instead of the normal barrel, and the SRC had more like an airplane wing, and another edition had this upside down airplane wing, and we experimented with different shapes there. But probably one might think that there's too much going on, but for a school, I guess it's not so bad. You know, the kids seem to enjoy it, and people we take in there are sort of stunned. You get lost. Maybe it's part of the fun. You wander around in the school, you don't know where you are and where you get out. So, but it's never. I never had complaints about it, but oddly enough.
I have maybe one more question. You mentioned that the faculty got involved in helping.
Right, in the planning, right.
Can you talk just briefly about that?
We had these meetings with the faculty that were going to use the buildings. And that's sort of also something we learned from Frank Lloyd Wright. He was very responsive to the people who were actually going to live in the houses or use the buildings if you could get at them. And we were fortunate there to have the faculty right on hand. So we could get their concerns, and they were helpful in the design. They were also, by getting them together, they could give and take a little because they knew that they couldn't have, each faculty member couldn't have everything he wanted, he or she wanted. And I know there were some things that were disappointing to me because as a former band director, one thing I did want was a band practice room with windows in it. And so did this one. But just because of the big cylinder, partly because of the economics, we didn't accomplish that. I always regret it. I think I figure a way to do it now, but it's a little late to go back unless someday somebody wants to put up some money for correcting architects' mistakes.
Okay.
Okay.
Great.